G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today I thought I'd share a rerun of a presentation I did the other day with Arcol, who ran an event called Retooling AEC, the future of the practice of architecture, where they had a variety of speakers talking about different takes on where the industry is moving, particularly in relation to technology and software. Arcol, of course, is developing their own platform, so of course they have a lot of interest in this topic. But my particular take was really talking about the perspective of someone working within a firm and how they perceive the transformation going on in the industry. And of course, true change comes from within was the focus. So I thought I'd just share this with the channel, given most of this is just already in the public anyway. So I hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to skip over the basic stuff. Most of you know I live in Australia, in Adelaide. I did present this at 6 a.m, so I was pretty tired, but luckily it's the afternoon today. The boring stuff where I work, nothing too interesting here, but of course currently I work with Architectus and BIM Consulting, their parented entity, and also have got my own consulting avenue, and of course YouTube that you're watching right now. And at the moment I'm focusing on computation and BIM specialist roles where I work. But I have, of course, worked at other firms of varying scales, mostly large-scale projects, over the last 11 years, which is where a lot of my context in this presentation is grounded. And, I'm into all sorts of stuff that isn't just about BIM and architecture, so just adding a bit of personality. Of course, I'm Australian, I have a lot of sarcasm and honesty. All opinions in this presentation are my own, but I've tried to keep them fairly constructive, honest but constructive, in the hope that they help people relate that are in similar positions to me, or maybe understand the plights or the challenges of people like myself who are choosing to work within businesses that are transforming. But of course, empathizing with the developers that are trying to help us get to the next generation of technology and industry. So talking about the future of AEC firms from the perspective of someone working within one. So where I work at the moment is really unique and really exciting. I work in a team of digital specialists managed by a principal. So we effectively have our own unique sector of the company that supports all the sectors individually. Of course, to the side, we have sectors such as the one I work in, advanced production, which deals with computation, automation, and visualization. We have a digital engineering team that mostly works outward facing, and a systems development team working with applications, mostly web applications or SharePoint integrations, but it helps support the business at a large scale with roughly 700 people in the company and just over 20 people on the team. The current reality for most AEC firms, especially large ones, is, not always the greatest, but there's a lot of opportunities and exciting things as well. Revit, of course, is, a great platform for what it does. Most people have come to realize it's not necessarily the next generation of technology. Even Autodesk has really told us that, we shouldn't be putting all our bets on this horse. There are bigger things coming, for example, their Forma platform. And of course, there are other companies and platforms out there. It's not just Revit. You've got Nemetschek Group with ArchiCAD, you've got Vectorworks, you've got Allplan. There are other options out there. But for a lot of firms, especially in the Australian market, Revit is a reality that we have to deal with. So, if I had a swear jar or a Revit jar, it would be quite full by the end of this presentation. So any architectural firm in the market is often dealing with similar technology stacks or proprietary software choices, for example, delivery tools, very much focused around Revit, of course, but we have integrations, we have cloud platforms that Autodesk offers, and we have tools such as Navisworks for coordination. Of course, we have what I call the bread and butter design tools as well, and these typically are less dependent on Autodesk for us, especially. They're often off to the side. Whilst they might integrate with Autodesk platforms, they are their own standalone beast as well. A lot of people don't really understand what BIM 2.0 is meant to look like. A lot of people think they need another Revit that does all the things. None of them perfectly well, but does all the things. Whereas really, realistically, we're looking more at an app store in the next generation of technology. A lot of these apps are open source, but there is a lot of misconception on what open source really means, what it's all about. I do think there's a lot of excitement around the fact that people don't think open source needs money to support it, or people don't charge you to use it. It's a big misconception, and it honestly will be a real challenge for a lot of developers hinging on open source in future, I think, but we'll see how it goes. So appflation is a challenge. There's a lot of things out there to try, sometimes buy, and it can be very difficult even for large companies to know exactly which things they should hedge their bets on or put their time into learning. But it is important to try out new things, especially if we're not necessarily going forward with the current applications that we're using in the indefinite future. Now, of course, where we work, Revit is a big thing. We've built a lot of stuff around it. It's not going away anytime soon. We've definitely hedged the bet there. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we don't try out other platforms or sometimes even use other platforms in order to deliver our projects. For the average user, it's really hard for them. I really sympathize to architects in particular. I mean, I don't really see myself as an architect holistically anymore, but I definitely can empathize with them. There are so many tools, so much information incoming. These aren't digital specialists in most cases. They might know how to use the tools, but it's really not what they're at work to do. They want to be architects, they want to design. It's a lot of information. So having those digital specialists is just so necessary these days to not only help guide them, but help filter the experience for them in their 9 to 5. It's also really hard to know who we can follow into the future because a lot of things happen to new platforms. Whilst you have your incumbents, your very large platforms like Revit and just Autodesk in general, and Nemetschek Group, those sorts of groups, they're probably going to be around for a very long time. They're a safe bet to some degree, depending on how much you can depend on them and their platforms to suit your business function. But of course, often products might seem good and then not have a product market fit, or the hype ran out, the funding ran out, or maybe they just fell back on developing an add-in for the incumbent instead, or they just sold off to the incumbent and stopped developing. There's a lot of things that happen to these platforms. Workable data beyond the platforms is also a really big challenge. Most people are okay at using Excel in the industry and architecture, but even some people really struggle to manipulate or work with data beyond just getting it and putting a border around it and doing something graphical. A lot of people still don't really understand data and structure. So even if new platforms come along, there's all these new things people are going to have to learn and get used to. For example, working with IFC data potentially, or JSON data structures, instead of just simple work sets and tables in Excel. One big challenge with some of these new open formats, or old open formats that are being newly supported, is that people tend to approach them with a platform or technology agnostic view. So for example, Building Smart with IFC intentionally doesn't really talk about Revit, for example, in the context of IFC. They talk about IFC in context of itself, which can make it difficult for the average user who only really understands a few pieces of software and not really a schema. So that can make real challenges for architects in particular. But again, having those digital guides is really, the crucial component. The market's in a really interesting state and has been for a while. I mean, as we know it right now, firms are having to hire a lot of people to convert data to do things on the side of project operations to make sure that we get what we need for the people that need it in time. As well as this, there's a lot of data loss, geometry loss, incompatibilities. We're building a lot of technical debt in these tools. I'll talk about technical debt in a bit if you don't know what that means. And as well as this, we're building silos to some degree. We really are building walls around our companies that insulate them with the systems we've chosen to follow. And some of this is, necessary to develop systems and build a business that works. But at the same time too, we have to be so conscious that we don't necessarily build ourselves into a hole that we can't get out of later. There are empires that own a majority of the software we use. And I'm not just talking Autodesk, I'm talking people like Microsoft, Adobe. There are major companies that own large portions of the technology stacks that architectural firms find themselves using. Of course, you can step to the side and use a lot of open source technology, but it's a lot of work to bring it all together and make it function for the average user. At the same time, it doesn't mean we don't mix open source technology into our workflows or try to sometimes move to the side of these large empires. Using the analogy, like the empire is not necessarily a purely bad thing. So this isn't a bash on Autodesk or someone like that, because if you've seen Star Wars, you'll know that the empire brings order to some degree to the galaxy as well, right? So whilst Revit doesn't do everything we want it to do, it's not perfect. For some users, it's enough. It does what they need it to do. They can move on, they get their job done. So to some degree, it does give us something that we know usually will work, but then it comes with catches. It's pay to play. We're on subscriptions now. There's price hikes. It's unpredictable. In an unpredictable market, unpredictable prices are a compound challenge to face for a business, especially if they change. There's APIs that limit what we can do. There's schemas that limit what we can do. These are necessary. You can't have software without these things. But at the same time, we are restricted by them to some degree, sometimes because of the legacy of choice that these companies have had to implement in the development or the lack of development in some software. So a lot of people are, working in this ecosystem. We see rebellion, we see glimmers of hope. Developers that have stepped to the side or left architectural firms and said, we can build different things that do different things in better ways. We see people discussing common formats of data so they can work together beyond their platforms, so less of a focus on proprietary file formats. As well as this, common data schemas such as IFC are becoming something that these people are focusing on because we need to speak a common language for our programs to work together. As well as this, a lot of them are really focusing on clean and simple inputs and outputs rather than complex hurdles. But this is obviously still developing, still happening. It's very much a work in progress state of the industry, and it's not necessarily clear what the next state is going to really look like. It could be a lot of different ways this goes. But hopefully the emergent competitive state is, we have more freedom of choice in what we can apply on our projects. Firms might decide to mix in more open source tools into their workflows or integrate them into their own developed solutions to democratize knowledge between firms, because we're all working in more consistent ways, which means there's less risk in telling each other how we're working because we're probably already doing a lot of it already through investing in more open workflows. And of course, hopefully there's no sequels or new orders that come after that. One really big challenge that we face in architecture firms, engineering firms, pretty much anyone that's delivering in the industry, is that drawings are still the legal tender, the legal deliverable. At the moment, we haven't really got anywhere near a state where regulatory bodies and clients are comfortable using models as deliverable, as instruction, as constructability on a project. We're still falling back on drawings. So we are shackled to platforms that produce drawings and deliver drawings for construction and also for design. So some platforms that are coming out, are great at feasibility, but they can't generate any drawings. For example, Rhino can do drawings, but not easily. So, we use it a lot in design, but not so much in delivery. So that is really what's keeping a lot of these firms shackled to these major platforms and corporations, arguably. But we are meeting at the crossroad with developers of new solutions and even existing developers of the larger solutions. For example, a lot of us do talk to Autodesk. We talk to their developers. We do voice challenges we face with them, but we also like to hear where they're going, what they're thinking, what the next state of the industry might look like for them as well. A lot of us, found our way to this industry from a lot of different backgrounds and skill sets. So, we're all very passionate about digital and BIM from this side, but we need to appreciate that, a lot of people like architects and engineers and project managers, digital is such a small part of what gets them excited in our industry. A lot of people are there to deliver ideas, projects, designs. We do need to meet in the middle with these people in architectural firms and, often just understand that we can't just get everyone excited through showing them technology. We have to contextualize it to their everyday needs. It's very important, but a huge challenge. We're all speaking similar languages when you take away the software, when you take away the platforms, the procedures. There are a lot of common ideas that we're talking, and also the programmers of the industry, despite the languages, the APIs, whatever we do, there's a lot of common ground. So I do encourage people to network and talk with people developing the next state of the industry and also those maintaining the current state to get an idea of the things that we share, and it might help you feel a bit better about the challenges you're facing. We're at a point where we do need most people on a project to have a consistent vision and also sometimes a consistent capability. Otherwise, we do run the risk that one wheel breaks the shopping trolley. It's not always the contractor. This is just a joke. But there are some really advanced technologies being used by certain consultants. But if a traditional deliverable or approach is forced onto the job, often these aren't really compatible with new technologies and new ways of working. It can really break the aspirations of the broader team. But communication, of course, is the only way we can really tackle this problem. We always look at the buy in or buy out. At a large firm, you can't just build your own technology all the time. You do have to use solutions that have been built by other people sometimes. So whilst you can use apps, sometimes you can build them. We have to weigh this up all the time. There's a lot of motivators behind buying in or buying out. Of course, most of the pros and the cons are flipped. So, obviously, it's great when you buy something because usually it just works. You can probably predict the costs to some degree, and you don't really have to resource that much money into it. It's mostly just training and paying for it. But of course, you pay for it. There's a cost. You don't necessarily have immediate access to developers from the software, or they might not incorporate your needs very quickly, so they might not be able to customize, and maybe they don't even last as an app. They might, just phase themselves out eventually, become vaporware. Of course, buying in, there are some cons that are also almost the flip side. From day one, you've got nothing. You're starting with a clean slate in most cases. You don't know how much this thing's really going to cost unless you've completely scoped it out. And even in that, you've had to spend time to do that. As well as this, you've got to resource this solution. You need people to build it, to maintain it, to train it. There's a lot of work involved in that. And not all companies are at a scale where they can do that, or just in a position where they can afford to do that, even if they're a large company. Of course, there are good things, sort of good things, like obviously salaries don't go up as fast as inflation and apps, and I don't think that's a good thing, but it is a reality of the corporate world. There is some mismatch in those paces. So you do sort of make money out of that, unfortunately. You own the solution. It's part of your business. It's part of your culture. It's part of your aspiration and your pride as a business to own this solution. You can customize it whenever you want, really, as long as someone has the time. And if you maintain it, of course, it's just going to work, hopefully. But here we are back on that technical debt topic. If you've never heard of this term, effectively it just means the more you build, the more you have to maintain, and the more choices you have to make that might not be the best choices in the long term. So you might write some code that's very messy or not optimized, and over time these things can start compounding. And depending on how you structure your team or allocate your time, you can build up a lot of technical debt that can really come crashing down if you're not careful when you develop your own software. At the same time, if you choose bad applications to use that might not last or might have problems, you might build up technical debt in terms of the time it takes to work with those solutions. And a lot of technical debt is built on legacy, very old code the company's built up, so it can be a big risk if your company's not on top of its own technical debt when it develops. Just an example of an in-house solution and the merits and the challenges that came with it. This is a tool for Revit that was developed in-house. Whilst I can't obviously share the code or the tool specifically, this is an example. This is a tool that was made to deal with room layout sheets. Some projects have upwards of 3,000 of these things that often have 5 or so views on them, generated from the model based on rooms. They can be a very timely deliverable. And whilst they do help the user groups, they don't really return a lot of value to the project beyond that. If anything, if people could use models, these would probably be invalidated as a deliverable. But again, that deliverable nature sort of ties us back to the reality of what we have to do. So we did use a paid solution at Architectus, Kiwi Codes, which has a great tool, the room data sheet tool, which probably should be called the room layout sheet tool, but anyway, it does have some challenges. You have to go through this interface each time you run it. There are limitations to how things are formatted. There's a bit of customization, but not as much as I'd want. It's one of hundreds of tools in the Kiwi Code toolbar, and we don't necessarily always want, 400 tools and 4 tabs just to run one tool. And of course, the views themselves don't necessarily always have immediate context or relation back to their views. That there is a system built in there, but it wasn't quite as flexible as I wanted it to be. There are other organization quirks that this doesn't capture. It's a tool built to reach the general market, but not necessarily just your company. So in our PyRevit toolbar, we integrated the toolkit that I developed, which was much more customizable. In this case, it stores the settings once, and you reference those settings using some code each time, which means you don't have to go and interact with that window each time. It generates views for rooms you select, which is a much more natural way for users to pick a room rather than from a giant list. Views are tied back to the room using the naming system of the views or the parameters that I populate. And there's a tool in there that can round views onto sheets at a separate stage to when you create the view, so you don't have to do it all in one. And it also, of course, follows, company branding and policy. There's a toolkit in there to regenerate room layout sheets if they've changed. So it's a very strong toolkit, but of course, it's not perfect. There are scary parts that come with doing this. You've got to obviously convince your company in the first place it's worth doing. That's really, really hard sometimes. It's only as bust-proof as the people that know or wrote the code. That is one problem. So if anyone leaves the company, you lose that understanding. Someone has to go and re-understand that code later. This doesn't actually use that much code for a software development exercise. It uses about 2,500 lines of code. Now that sounds like a lot, but software can grow well beyond that as a toolkit. So it was quite an efficient coded solution in the end for what it does. But we have dependency on Revit. It needs training and maintenance. And code is only as safe as, the application you use to host it in. Revit's a fairly open solution, so whilst there are some security measures built in to try and stop people lifting the code out and taking it elsewhere, if they really knew how, they probably could. But all businesses have that challenge with most of their solutions. But ultimately, the tool was ours as a business. It solved a challenge, it built an appreciation and understanding, and also an identity behind the tool so people know they can come to me as the developer, which is very different to using an application which is quite faceless in nature. Of course, if I ever get the chance to open source this one day, I will. At the moment, we're working on this in-house. It's probably not an open sourceable initiative in current state, but you never know. The API that I use, the Revit API, it doesn't do everything and it doesn't do it perfectly. There are some pretty old pieces of code I'm interacting with to do things that probably weren't anticipated when the API was developed and also when Revit's code under the hood was written as well. One thing, for example, was when I regenerate room layout sheets, I need to get the position of an elevation marker to move it so I can move the pointers. The Revit API has no way for an elevation to naturally tell me its location or its marker, which seems silly. It should just have a location, right? But below the hood, it obviously isn't exposed or it's not available in the code. So you implement lots of workarounds that are quite awkward when you're dealing with APIs sometimes. So for example, if I take an elevation marker, I can ask it for its views using the API. I can ask those views for their crop frames in 3D. I can get the corners of those crop frames and get the average point of all those corners put together. And that will typically, for a 4-point elevation marker, be roughly the center point of the marker itself. But obviously that's, a very unintuitive process for a coder to follow until they've found that solution. Now there's heaps of workarounds like this in programming. It's not like you always just have 2 lines of code that will do it all for you. You have to do a lot of workarounds, a lot of geometry manipulation and processing. But this can build up a lot of technical debt into the code if people don't understand how it's been done. And it can also just make a fairly hostile experience for the coder as well. But it works. An example of developing in-house solutions that require a bit more flexibility in design is using Rhino. So getting a request from a user, asking for in this case, some balconies that fluctuate beyond the form of the building. Now there's not really like an app that's dedicated to doing this specifically. There's no, balcony generator.app or something. This is a custom task. And we end up needing solutions like Grasshopper in order to meet these needs typically. So in this case, we developed some algorithms. We can generate some wavy or pocket balconies. There are controls built into this so the user can play with it from a design perspective. And, it solves a problem that's what we would call a fringe case. And a lot of the apps being developed these days don't necessarily deal with fringe cases very well. They don't really build themselves to solve them because you only solve a very small part of the market if you focus on fringe cases. But at the same time, design really is a lot of fringe cases at the end of the day. So it can be very hard to build apps that address the holistic process of design and ideation. So platforms like Grasshopper are great for this. And at the same time too, this is like, 1 to 2 hours of development time to build this toolkit. And obviously you save a heap of time in the production of these forms. To do these manually, it would be a pain and you wouldn't really get a very smart, geometrically sophisticated outcome by just eyeballing the screen and doing it manually. So at the end of the day, it's a clear solution which allows the user to interact with it and it can adjust to meet the design needs. Grasshopper really was lightning in a bottle for the industry. It's a unique application. It really does feel like it's built for designers when you know how to use it. But of course, it took a long time for this thing to reach our industry properly. It's still very niche. Not many people can build good Grasshopper scripts in my experience. And honestly, mine probably aren't even that good compared to, the best computational designers out there in the industry. It's not always understood by people too. People look at spaghetti and they don't really know what they're looking at. It looks scary, it looks weird, it doesn't look like design. And of course, it's still a fringe case. This isn't a tool that went and solved every challenge for balconies in the whole company. It solved one project. So it can still be hard to justify developing solutions like this. But I guess the reason why Grasshopper is so successful is that it did capture design process to some degree. We can get a degree of fluid feel when we use it. And I find a lot of the modern applications don't necessarily feel that way yet. They do have a degree of clunk to them a lot of the time. So I do encourage developers to look at these types of solutions and figure out, what they got right, because I feel like this is one of a few apps that really did capture design. Of course, at Architectus and BIM Consulting, there are in-house web solutions as well. So for example, this is from their website as well, but they have an application called BCAP, or the BIM Consulting application, which is effectively an issue tracking and resolution module where people can communicate and invite teams in. And of course, we have full control over this. The best thing about this is it doesn't belong to a single application. It's not built upon the Revit API. It's not built upon SharePoint. It's a web application that can be developed to interact with applications through add-ins and other sorts of things. But ultimately, this application can move beyond the current generation of technology if we need it to. As well as this, at the core, it really is task focused. It's not really built around software. So whilst it can serve software related purposes, it can be expanded into different means. For example, people could take meeting minutes in an application like this, which allows people to comment on items in the minutes and make a more social document. ADT, or the Architectus Delivery Tool, is also developed through BIM Consulting. Again, you can see this on their website, so it is public domain. It's built through SharePoint, so it does have some degree of dependency, of course. I mean, everything's dependent to some degree, but this one obviously completely dependent upon SharePoint. But at the same time, it's developed and customized to the firm's needs, which would not work at other firms who have completely different delivery systems. The challenge with applications I see is often they're riding hype waves. They're on the hype curve. We're on the Gartner hype cycle. A lot of them get over the peak of overinflated expectations, which is the nickname for the top of that peak, where everyone's got really excited about it. And they've said, let's see it, let's do it. They show it and everyone goes, oh, that's it. Is that all it does? It's not Revit 2.0. And down we go to the trough, where they've got to actually make this thing work. So developers really do need our support in point 1, down in the trough, because the only way they get up to point 2 is through support, use, encouragement, and enthusiasm for the product. A lot of people just stand at point 2 and wait and say, come on, let me know when you're done. But really, we need more people in the industry to interact and follow these applications and really try them, use them, test them, and let people know what works for the industry. If we just stand back and wait, honestly, nothing's going to get out of the trough. And then we end up with, sort of productive, but not quite productive solutions the industry's tried, like complaining in the open letter. I'm not sure this is really the way to go. I do encourage architecture firms to engage with the application developers of the next industry state, and also experiment with their own applications if they can, because otherwise we just end up in these situations where we're just dependent on one piece of technology because we just didn't evolve as an industry technologically. For example, Excel, that there are whole industries out there where Excel is the technological backbone of those industries, and it's really scary. I mean, imagine if someone tripled the cost of Excel overnight. I mean, obviously you can't do it because of fair trading, but if they found a way to do it, most businesses would have no pivot point, at least from their vantage point. So true change does really come from within. You can't just rely on software developers to do everything for you or expect to get everything right for you unless you really talk to them. I encourage developers externally to keep going. We're catching up, we're trying to bring people to you from these firms, but talk to us as much as you can, engage with us. Take on our feedback, but let us know when we're maybe not understanding the next state of the industry as you see it. To people inside firms developing solutions, keep going. You're doing a great job too. But make sure you keep an eye on what's developing and coming in the industry. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, in one API, in one programming language. Try to keep your ideas flexible and keep them rigid but flexible. So rigid in some sense. That was a really bad metaphor. Anyway, my point is we've got to talk. We've got to communicate. And that's why I love events like this and things like NXT Build, because they bring people together, not only just to complain, but to relate, to understand, and to progress beyond the state we're at. So do talk. But I pretty much got to the end. I guess I didn't really run out of time this time because I could take it pretty slow. But I guess I always encourage people to develop applications that live beyond whatever program they happen to be using right now. Talk about logic and thinking. Don't just talk about software and API. Talk about the techniques and the thought processes when you're training people. I recommend companies need user groups. They need socialization of these movements. Otherwise, people just aren't aware of what's happening or what's coming or what's wrong at the same time. But at the same time, look beyond your company's walls. Go to forums, join forums. Don't just read and look at them. Actually be a part of them if you're passionate about these things. Look to external user groups. Set up informal social groups in your city to try and really just talk about what's happening right now, because otherwise you really lose the bigger picture. But I guess thanks for listening again, and thanks for Arcol for having me along. I hope it was an interesting presentation and maybe encouraged some further thought and development from people out there. And I look forward to hearing what people think. And if you have other comments, or if you don't agree, if you have other opinions, feel free to put them in the comments. I'm not going to say I'm right about everything. Some of these things are my opinion, but I look forward to seeing what you think. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Take care. Bye.